I'm going to talk about the regulatory work that we've been doing as part of WP5. I'm going to focus again on the regulatory concepts and the work carried out in the work package led by Professor Marco Viceconti from the University of Bologna and Wim D'Arte from Novartis. So the main and overarching goal of our work package was actually to get to the qualification, or at least to get to know what's needed to reach the qualification of the mobilized methodologies to support the marketing authorization of new drugs. And we basically divided our work in three main subtopics. So first of all, of course, we need to engage with the regulators, which in our case were the European Medicines Agency and the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in the US. And through these interactions, we were then able to develop and refine the regulatory plan. And as part of this work as well, we worked towards the regulatory qualification or certification of the mobilized analytics software. Why do we need to do that, however? Lynn just briefly mentioned that whenever you need to put a new medicinal product on the market, you first need to get it authorized by a local or the competent regulatory agency, again, FDA or EMA in our case. And when you do so, you need to show a proof of safety, efficacy, and quality. And for the first two bullet points here, you actually normally run a clinical trial where you go and measure accepted clinical endpoints. Now we have new methodologies that can be used to complement what is typically done within a clinical trial. And a clear example of these are DMOs. And however, before you can use any such methodology to support your claims, you also need to qualify this first. Okay, so this is one of the main goals of our work package. I also mentioned that we, nice pictures, that we also work on the software. And Lynn also mentioned that there is the concept of a device agnostic piece of software, meaning that as long as the sensors that collect the raw data actually meet specific requirements, our mobilized analytics software should be able to provide as accurate DMOs as those measures into the technical validation study. And if you see the software this way, so software that can be basically embedded in different hardware, we can also see it as a software as a medical device. And once more, if you want to exploit it commercially, you would also need to qualify or certify it. But we don't really know yet exactly what should be done in the regulatory framework to do so, so we inquired and we did some piece of work about this as well. Before diving into what we actually did, I think I felt the need probably to give you some background about regulatory science, or at least what we need to know, the basics. And first of all, I mentioned that we did interact with both the EMA and the FDA, and you may need to know that there are some little differences here and there, especially all of the qualification processes are different in terms of duration and timeline, the amount and kind of evidence that you need to provide to the regulators, as well as one of those also have fees attached, and the kind of feedback and documents that you get in response to your inquiry may be slightly different as well. But one of the key differences here is that there are huge differences sometimes also in the definitions, and the biomarker definition is one of those. So if you can read through that, there's quite a bit of difference between what the European Medicine Agencies tells as biomarkers and what the Food and Drug Administration say. And in our specific case, given that we are going to measure quantities, of course, the FDA one that clearly mentions that a biomarker is a characteristic that you can measure, well, that's the one that fits better our purposes. Now, let's dive into what the qualification process with EMA is. This is almost deliberately a little bit messy, okay? Because it's a long process that you see immediately. You have up top in blue and green, basically all of the actions that are up to the applicant, in our case, the mobilized consortium, and in orange, the actions on the European Medicine Agency. And you see that from the moment you actually start your procedure, which starts actually here, day 0 is over here, you have a number of interactions with the regulatory authorities. You submit a briefing book. We'll see in a minute what this is. And then the EMA assesses it. It gives you a list of issues that you need to reply to in a written form, and potentially also supplement it with some discussion meeting. Then you provide the new revised version of your manuscript of your briefing book to the scientific advisory working party, and then if that goes well, you get a positive feedback, and even if your methodologies are promising, they also issue a letter of support. Now, of course, things change a little when you want to go also for a qualification opinion, which is a final recommendation, because you would need to prove that your methodologies are technically and clinically valid as well. Now, if this seems long enough, actually, sometimes, especially the very first time you approach them, you may want to go for further discussions with different parties within the European Medicine Agency to first draft the regulatory plan and have an idea on how to approach them properly. Then, again, the main features of all this process were there since the beginning of this slide. And first of all, it's all very regulated with the European Medicine Agency because, well, you can't really see much. This was just to show that you can find it online. You have specific dates for every single step in the process, so you know when you have to submit in order to finish in a certain time. You know when they will reply back to you and when you have to reply back to those replies. And, well, if you start to put things together, especially when it's the first time you approach them, you may go for different rounds of qualification advice, as we did. And if you sum all of this time plus the time to go to a qualification opinion, that can take up to several months, maybe a couple of years as well. And there's a fee attached to all this process, which can be reduced if the applicant is a small or medium enterprise. I mentioned earlier that the procedure starts when you produce this document, the briefing book that you provide and you submit to the regulator. This is a dossier with all of the relevant information that you would like to provide in order to get a useful feedback. So there are two main sections. The first is an introductory section where you basically lay the land. You say why you want to do that, what's the rationale behind you seeking advice from the regulator. And then there's the questions and applicants position section where actually you go and directly ask the questions on which you want feedback from the regulator itself. But you don't just provide or ask questions, you also provide your sort of plan to address them, because you want to see whether they feel that your plan actually makes sense and could be in principle endorsed. And this is important because when you are at the qualification advice stage, whatever feedback you get is actually not binding. These are just indications. Of course, if they endorse it, it's likely that they won't change their mind later on, but it's just still an indication. And one more thing to know is that the briefing book, of course, will change in content between a qualification advice or a qualification opinion, because this section will be probably completed not with question and answers, but with the actual technical data and clinical data in support of your claim. When we go to the FDA, the process may look a little bit simpler, the way I put it here. Again, we have blue squares for what is actually up to the applicants and orange for what's up to the FDA in this case. You see that there's always an exchange of information somehow. The applicant provides or submits a letter of intent, LOI, which is basically similar in content to the briefing book. The first iteration is fairly short in time, like the FDA may reply in 3 months, up to 3 months. And then the more you keep going, the more evidence you need to provide, and therefore the more time also for the regulator to reply to you. What is important to notice, and a difference compared to what you do with the EMA, is that first, this process is free of charge, but more importantly, there's not a fixed timeline, because once they reply to you, you may take up all of your time that you need and want to go to the next step, okay? But more important as well is that part of the content that is within the documents that you submit goes public. So you really need to make sure that you don't say too much in the sections that will go public if you want to keep the information to yourself. This is just to show you that actually you can find some examples already online on the websites of both agencies. This could be useful to give you an idea of what you should or what you would like to put into your documents. And what about the qualification of the software? I mentioned earlier on that we may consider our software, the Mobilise analytic pipeline, as a software as a medical device, in that it actually may work with different hardware. Therefore, can be a medical device and therefore a medical product. And in order to exploit it commercially, as I mentioned earlier, you may need to get a like a feedback from, like not a notification, sorry. It needs to be somehow notified by a regulatory body. In Europe, this would mean getting the CE mark. In the US, a pre-market notification 510K or a pre-market approval. What they would require for you to show is that your software as medical device and the combination with the system is actually providing accurate and precise measurements, DMOs in our case. And to do so, you may need to show first that whatever comes out of your software is actually comparable to gold standard measures. And in terms of precision, you may be required to show that you stress test your system so it works as expected in several different conditions, not just the ones that you were actually testing. Of course, the complexity increases the higher is the claim, and this may become impractical for small enterprises as well. But we do also have another option, because we may think of considering the software as medical device as a black box, a predictive model that takes input, the raw data, and transforms it into a DMO, so a prediction. If this is the case, we may think we can actually apply the ASME VND40 credibility assessment standards that were introduced by the FDA in 2018. This is probably a bit simpler than the whole metrological characterization I mentioned earlier. And in the end, it's actually providing similar information, because you would need to test that your model is actually verified, so the code is verified, the output is validated, and you also did some checks in terms of how the uncertainty in the inputs actually propagates into the output. Now, before seeing what we can do to unravel this ambiguity, which process to go for, you may also need to be aware that if you have any machine learning or AI-based algorithms within your pipeline, you may need to go to a further extent to show actually that you do all of the jobs also after post-marketing, as a surveillance, for example, or quality management as well. Now, if you are unsure on what to do, actually the FDA gives you the opportunity to ask them directly suggestions, or at least an indication on what would be, for example, the best approach forward. And I'm not going to go into the details of these. This is the process called Q-submission, which is part of the pre-submission program. And what you see in here is that actually in as short as 70 days, you can get a written feedback at least, so you would have a first idea of what the regulators would point you towards. Now, let's come to us. I'm going to go quite quickly on these last two slides, because already Lynn was mentioning earlier that at first we may have thought it was more of a straight, a bit bumpy line, but that would take us to regulatory qualification of our demos, or at least to know what we would need to do. This was just merely a dream, because indeed it was something like this. She already mentioned COVID-19, so I'm not going to go over with that, but we also had to face from a regulatory point of view the fact that Emma was relocating because of Brexit. So, yeah. So there were delays in all of the processes, and that was not great, of course. And along the way, we also needed to revise a little bit our strategy based on the feedback we were getting. Nonetheless, from the very start of the project till the end, we actually accomplished quite much. We did interact with both the EMA and the FDA. We did get 2 letters of support, as well as 3 publications summarizing what we actually achieved. And the very first step was to interact with both the agencies, because one of the opportunities you are given is also to try to go for a joint feedback. But what came out was actually that for the FDA, maybe this was a little bit too early at the very start of the process to engage with them, so we went with the AMA. And in October 2018, we submitted the first briefing book. The goal here was actually to try to get a feedback, a sense of what the regulators were thinking about our general implant, so this technical validation study, as Lynn was mentioning earlier, and I think as Andrea will explain better later, and also about the clinical validation, so whether it was built in a way that could be in principle accepted. And to make it simpler to us and to them, we actually restricted it to what was one of the diseases or clinical indications where we were, that was a bit more mature in our consortium, and that was Parkinson's disease. So we just wanted to see, cool. So anyways, this is what we wanted to see, and it was actually quite good because we managed to get like some good feedback out of the regulators. we learned that early engagement is key, and that actually we can, like our studies in principle could be endorsed or accepted by the regulator itself. We went for a second round of qualification advice where we tried to go further, so we extended the clinical validation and technical validation to support the use of DMOs as monitoring biomarkers for the other diseases, and we also aimed a little bit bigger. This time also we were successful in a way because we got our letter of support and the publication, and we realized actually that a narrow focus would be better when you approach the regulators, as well as what Lynn mentioned also earlier on, a randomized clinical trials may be needed if you want to show clinical validity of your methodologies. Regarding the FDA, we actually are at a very preliminary stage because we just submitted a draft letter of intent. We didn't get much of a feedback yet, but we just realized actually that we really need to connect all the dots and make sure that we show that what we do is actually relevant to the patients as well. And this also calls for more qualitative works potentially and a little bit more of patient and public engagement, involvement and engagement. For the software, there's not much more to say because we submitted a Q submission request, but we didn't get any answers yet because they should be coming at the end of the month, actually, so very soon. And then we can give you some more updates. And what we learned, actually, I saw that this image also Lynn used it, so cool. So yeah, you need an interdisciplinary team, and not just within your party, but also with whom you talk to. And for that, you can actually ask to extend the suggested list of experts that can actually be involved in the whole assessment. You would need a clear strategy, and you can learn from the others as well as from early engagement with the regulators. You need to know what you put in your briefing book, and that means that you need to do a lot of work and actually convey it in a meaningful manner and also ask the right questions. And finally, well, you need to speak the same language. So it's better if you define some definitions, and that's what we do, and we did, and you need to be consistent with that all the way through. And yeah, I'm speeding up because I was 5 minutes late already earlier. So, and then you don't need to rush it as I was doing, because you can just start to build your jigsaw, your puzzles from the corners and then from the frame, and then you can get to complete the whole picture. And that's it. If you get something, you can also share it. That would be good, and everyone would like it. And that's it.